Yeah, so we'll pick back up. Again, this isn't a private conversation. If there's any areas of questioning that we get into that you don't want to talk about, just let me know. Um, so, yeah, let me just give the introduction. Today is Wednesday, November 2nd, 2016. My name is Andy Reisinger, and I'm doing a follow-up interview with Nan Orrock here in the Department of Special Collections and Archives at Georgia State University as part of the Great Speckled Bird Oral History Project. And if I can just get your verbal consent to be recorded.
Yes, you have my verbal consent to be recorded.
Perfect.
And I look at you as opposed to the camera.
You can look at me, or you can look
okay.
into the camera, however you're comfortable. So the last time we talked, we've spoken twice now, and in the first interview, I think we got a lot of your childhood and sort of formative experiences coming into the civil rights movement in college, and last time explored a little bit more of your college work and organizing in Virginia. I think also got into some of your work with SOC. And then came to Atlanta and began working with the bird. If we can just start and quickly retrace some ground, can you remind me when you moved to Atlanta and exactly why it was that you came here?
Yeah, Gene Guerrero and I had married in the mid-'60s, and we were working with Southern Student Organizing Committee. He was maybe possibly the first or second chair of that organization, and we, through his efforts to launch labor work and engage students with labor in the South, we moved to North Carolina, and SOC worked with the Textile Workers Union of America. Peter Brandon was the lead staff on that, and he had a vision of reconstituting old textile mill locals across North Carolina. And we were there playing the role of connecting the student movement and student activism with labor activism. And that's what took us to North Carolina. Lived in Greensboro, and then actually wound up working on a strike in North Carolina, down about 60 miles west of Wilmington, and organize a contract strike. But we left after that strike was concluded. We moved to Atlanta because Gene was a conscientious objector, and he had received his draft notice, and he was from Atlanta. He had registered for the draft in Atlanta, and that's where he was going to refuse to step forward if he could not negotiate to receive his conscientious objector status. He had been denied conscientious objector status, and the attorney, Al Horn, God rest his soul, was based here in Atlanta. All of the proceedings were going to be in the federal court here in Atlanta if it got to that. And so we relocated to Atlanta to take on that battle. And this was at the conclusion of the work, the SOC work in North Carolina, which had some successes and did link students and workers, and was a great experience for me. I may have mentioned that I had been so immersed in the battles on civil rights barricades in the Deep South, down right at the grassroots on the local level, in Southside Virginia, with Klan presence and our office being shot up, and we were running a 6-county organizing project supported by SNCC to expand voting rights and engage the community and build and support locally based leadership that was rooted in the community. So I had been just firmly embedded in that reality, and overwhelmingly every white person you saw was hostile. We were challenging the old ways of Southern life in rural Black Belt counties right down on the border of North Carolina. And so working in labor in North Carolina later was a whole a brave new world, because there were white workers side by side with black workers battling for a contract in a knitting mill. And the African American workforce, this was their first factory job. They were coming into a manufacturing facility for the first time because the civil rights movement had opened the gates to wider employment. They were coming from an NAACP background. Typically would have been the organization that they followed along with the black church. And the white folks were coming from a culture really influenced by the Klan and very reactionary, typical Southern white racist views. So you had this admixture of these two populations fighting together, so it was an incredible shift from all the whites that you were with being hostile, and having white people see black people as allies, and black people seeing white people as allies, although you got to check them out constantly, because right beneath the surface are a lot of their views that they've not ditched. So that was an incredible learning experience, and a shifting of giving me a way to have a fuller understanding and appreciation of white working class people, and the fact that they were so victimized themselves because they had been absolutely the danger point. In the Deep South, that's who you stayed away from, and were cautionary doesn't even describe how people were being killed at the hands of in the main working class white people, backed up by the elites of the community, by the all the organizations and efforts of the white folks in power. And so that was a very enlightening experience, and grounded me in the labor movement and the struggles of labor, and the potential for interracial unity around class struggles. So from that battlefield, where ultimately it was, the workers did not resolutely win that battle at all, but it was a long one, and at some point the Textile Workers Union made a decision that they weren't going to get any more out of that situation from that company, and so there was a settlement that fell short of what it could have, should have, would have been. At any rate, but we came to Atlanta, and it was late '66, early '67, and moved into decaying neighborhoods over around Ponce de Leon that were decaying because of white flight. And that's when our little cabal of 6 people, the Coffins and Howard and Ann Romaine, Thomas Stephanie Coffin, Ann and Howard Romaine, and Jean Guerrero and I, all 3 couples, we began hatching the plan that would later hatch into the Great Speckled Bird. And that's how we arrived. That's how we arrived in Atlanta. And Jean had a whole saga of going into federal court. It was a good decision to move here. We were on the front lines of fighting for him to not be, imprisoned, and went through federal court trial alongside Cleve Sellers, who was SNCC activist leader out of South Carolina who went back to South Carolina and ultimately became president of a college in South Carolina, but was part of the Orangeburg massacre when police swept the campus and students were killed. Cleve was involved in that. Cleve Sellers had also refused to be drafted. He and Jean had their cases side by side in federal court and their sentencing date the same. And Cleve gave a stalwart, fiery speech at the point of his sentencing. The judge gave them both 5 years, which was the maximum at that time for refusing to step forward. And Jean and Cleve were out on appeal, and ultimately the Supreme Court, before their appeals were resolved, the Supreme Court ruled in another case that conscientious objector status could be bestowed on someone who was not claiming to be a member of a traditional religious denomination. You could hold principled ideas, objecting to war and participation in the war machine, and qualify for CO status without being actually a member of a traditional denomination. And when that ruling came down, then both Cleve and Jean were, their cases were reversed. They were. So he didn't serve time. Jean didn't serve time. Cleve didn't serve time, and there we were. Here we were in Atlanta. So all that unfolded simultaneously. The building of the bird, and I would say that in my mind's eye, this was in absolutely the very heart of the heated anti-war movement, the national debate on the U.S. being in Vietnam, and we were of strong opinion that there needed to be a voice to counter the Atlanta Journal and the Atlanta Constitution. There were two papers at that time, morning and evening, but there needed to be a voice to tell the truth about the war. So the roots of that newspaper, the alternative press, the underground press, today we call it independent journalism, but the roots of that were to speak out and educate the public about the war and take issue with the pro-war sentiments that the mainstream press, reflected.
And how was it that you came to know Howard and Nan and Tom and Stephanie?
Well, Howard and Nan, Howard and Nan were in the Southern Freedom Movement, and we were very close. Howard and Jean had been in the White Folks Project of SNCC in summer of '64, Mississippi summer of '64, and where there was an effort with few breakthroughs to assign white Southerners into some of the more moderate places on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi to try to learn from work winning over and influencing white people to support moderated views on race and to be voices for moderation. And so Ed Hamlet, Jean Guerrero, Howard Romaine, those are three people that were part of that. Sam Shira, but the white Southerners who were very close to. And at that point, Jean had already participated before he joined in that Mississippi summer as an Emory student. He had participated, and he's all on record on this, I'm sure. The demonstrations in downtown restaurants in Atlanta as students, and so they knew each other. Howard and Jean knew each other. We came back and built work on Virginia campuses to launch the Virginia Student Civil Rights Committee. Howard was a student leader at UVA, and Ann was in a master's program at UVA. She was pursuing her degrees, and they were both at UVA, and ultimately married as a result of coming together there, probably in '65, probably the summer after the year after They went from the Mississippi summer straight into grad school, and that's how they knew each other, and how we knew them is because we were all Southern Student Organizing Committee, SOC. And Ann was organizing folk tours for SOC to raise money. That's a real mark that she left, using traditional black, white performers coming out of the different cultures of the South, and going on tour. Bernice Reagan, who later founded Sweet Honey in the Rock, who is a member of the original Freedom Singers from SNCC, was a part of that. So Ann was working on that a lot, but we were very connected and close friends. And Ann and Howard had been a part of building VSCRC and coming into the county for the first summer, into one of the Black Belt counties in Southside Virginia. So we had much shared history. We had our senior year. I was at Mary Washington. Howard and Ann were at UVA, and they worked and we worked and collected items, clothing, other necessities, and drove them down to Mississippi in a big truck. Christmas of '64, really just months after we had left the Mississippi Summer Project, when we were both in school, and I spent that Christmas break in Mississippi, having driven the supplies down there, and that's when I was jailed in Laurel, Mississippi, working with the SNCC folks, and we were arrested in a restaurant for seeking integrated services. Mm-hmm. I believe I've talked about that. Yes. So that's how we knew each other. And Stephanie and Tom came on the scene. I don't know quite where we met them. They were leaving. Came from college. Drove across the country, and who was where the connective tissue was. I've really now forgotten, because we've had so many years of being friends. But we were literally having dinner together as three couples, often and repeatedly, and the work of building this newspaper evolved at an early point. And of course, Howard always had been a big writer. Tom was a big writer. I was a writer of not a newspaper, but I was very comfortable writing, and came out of that academic background. So that's how we wound up connected, and really living pretty close together in the same neighborhood over there in the shadow of the old Krispy Kreme on Ponce de Leon. Mm-hmm. And that's where the thinking started. And I'm sure that Tom and Jean and Howard, other people will have clearer memories of that than I will, is my guess. And you've probably captured it all on tape by now.
Pieces. But it'll all come together with everybody's recollection.
Exactly. But I do underscore that the war and the anti-war movement, the student movement, the counterculture movement, all of those movements were swirling around in a heady mix. This was the '60s, and we lived it, and so all of that energy was there, kind of emerging simultaneously across many fronts, and we both reflected it, were of it, and covered it. Mm-hmm. The Great Speckled Bird.
Did you have a vision of what you wanted the paper to be beyond being a counter voice to the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, sort of specifically of what what you all hoped that the paper would do for Atlanta?
I don't know exactly how to answer that. I mean, it was speaking truth to power, and again, different people involved probably had different views and perspective on where this was going. There was not a grand scheme of 10 years, although probably someone walking around had that, like Howard Romaine or Tom. It's interesting to reflect on, and it would be interesting to reflect together, you know, in a group about that. And what was surprising, I would say, that we were all hard-edged, hard-nosed political people. We were of the left and understood ourselves to be that, and change makers and challenging the status quo. That was in the DNA of all 6 of us. And so we saw the paper as being an outlet for those views that were under attack, and there was a massive public debate raging in the country and around the world around the U.S. role, U.S. imperialism in Southeast Asia, and SNCC folks were the people that first opened my eyes to that. I mean, when you are entering into a social change movement, typically, are just drawn from my experience. You start connecting the dots, and seeing the role that institutions play, and seeing the how opinions are formed, what point of view is pushed out, how policies are justified, and the lines are drawn, and the sides start lining up, and we knew which side of history we were on. What I didn't, what took me by surprise at the time was this emerging and erupting youth culture, sex, drugs, rock and roll revolution sort of theme that emerged just right away in the pages of the Bird, and it was a stream of another sector or another movement, if you will, and younger people. We opened up shop in where the hippies were. I mean, that all of those. We were not self-conceived hippies. We were political people, but the flower power movement was blossoming right alongside. I mean, the anti-war sentiments. This was sweeping the nation, and it was just a time of enormous. It's a real cultural shift was occurring in the nation, and I was speaking for myself, was very much on the political side, and here comes all of these artists, music, challenging the system in the old ways and the old perspectives culturally, and they found a happy marriage at the Great Speckled Bird that wasn't without its bumps, and debates on how much white space to have in the paper and how much art to have in the paper, and but it ultimately and so you had people who were strictly coming from a cultural perspective, and didn't know the names of U.S. senators that were voting on the war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're not following national politics in the same way that we were, but all of that came together in the Bird, and it was a cooperative. We found that we built it as a cooperative. I don't know whose bright idea that was, but so staff meetings and editorial meetings and decision making was fascinating, because as we matured and got our feet on the ground beneath us, more and more strains and perspectives were coming together that reflected the cultural shift in the country, and we became a haven for young kids that were coming in from the suburbs on the weekends or running away from home. All the youth alienation piece that was going on, they found the Bird and found a way to make some money by selling the bird, but also talent from all those ranks came forward, and so we always had that reality in the bird of the tensions between a cultural approach, music art, and others who would have just put out a tome of print, line after line, column inch after column inch of print. And what on earth are you putting that guy's cartoons in this paper for? Taking up room. We could have put 3 more articles there. That was the nature of the debate, and it was a healthy debate. And I had a great opportunity to have my eyes much more opened about all the ways that you can reach people, the different mediums, and how critically important art and culture are in an effort to promote sea change in the body politic.
And what were some of your roles on the paper in the day-to-day operation?
Well, I was, many of us had other jobs. It was all very, we built in more structure and more structure and more structure as time went on. We were building the plane while we were flying it. And I don't really now sort out, this period I was working here and then I was working there. I mean, we had household budgets to keep up, and we were paid very, very pitifully. But it was the nature of the beast. I mean, when I was in Southside Virginia working via CRC, I think we got $6 a week at an early point in time, and that would, buy Cokes and cigarettes and packages of nabs, and then you're on your own because we were being housed and fed by the community. So there were no grand wages, and people worked part-time, pitched in, showed up on layout night, whatever. And so I had other employment at points in that time. I worked at the Rich's bookstore. I worked at the ACLU for Chuck Morgan, the regional ACLU. That was doing incredible work, breathtaking, show-stopping work on voting rights and individual rights, and the Muhammad Ali case and the Howard Levy case, one man, one vote, on and on and on. And I worked at the Emory Legal Services where Maynard Jackson was a young attorney, and where he cooked up, he was there when he evolved into a candidate for the U.S. Senate seat against Old Man Talmadge. So I always was a backbone person on production. We had the latest and greatest typesetter, sort of IBM Selectric, whatever, different gizmos from IBM, and I was a master typist. I will proudly say that the federal government tested me at 100 words a minute in 1963 when I worked up there for the summer. So anyway, I loved typing and editing and proofreading, and that was really a mainstay job that I performed kind of throughout my time on the Bird. And there were others who really led in layout. There were others who led in producing copy. But we all sat and made decisions together about all this stuff, what we were going to cover, what the next issue was going to look like, what the cover was going to look like. We were in a cooperative, and we had these big meetings seeking consensus. And Gene worked more on payroll there than I did. I mean, I don't have a clear distinction of when I was working elsewhere and when I was working there. I mean, the things evolved and changed and moved along. And I was working at Rich's probably as we were cooking it up. That was I think the first job I had when we got to that I found when we moved to Atlanta. And Gene, then there was the writing, and the things that I covered more were women's stuff and labor stuff, and I was not at all a primary writer of copy. I was not in every issue. You'd have to hunt, and I think that I doubted myself enough. I was insecure enough about my ideas that when it came to setting them down in black and white, I would agonize over it and get writer's block. And so I did not write extensively for the Bird. I did not write extensively. I was very involved in building the women's voice and the women's caucus inside the Bird, and that there are all of these streams of social protest and social consciousness and awareness that were emerging and evolving, and I became very active, played a pivotal role on women's issues, and we had big internal struggles on fighting against chauvinism and women finding their voice, and fighting against just male domination of everything, of the decisions and the power dynamics. So that was the thread that ran throughout the Bird most of its existence, I'd say, after the first year or so. And interestingly, in SNCC, that had emerged, the women in SNCC had ultimately emerged raising questions about second-class status in SNCC and discriminatory treatment in SNCC, and when the credit got passed out and the people that came up to the forefront, they were men, and the women were doing massive amounts of work, but not on an equal footing with men in terms of being recognized in SNCC. And that was the conversations that women were having in SNCC, and it's mentioned in John Lewis's graphic novels, the 3-volume graphic novel March. He describes how women wrote a paper on what is the position of women in SNCC. Mary King and some other people. It's in John's book, and those people and that thinking, influenced me. People had relocated to Washington. I was invited into conversations of women from SNCC, Dorothy Burlage, and other folks that convened in Washington to look back and talk about some of this, which is when I came to understand the gender gap and the history of the women's movement and the movement that emerged and blossomed in the 60s, women's consciousness raising. So we had all of that going on as a part of the fabric of the Bird's culture, and that was women battling for equal status, standing, and power within the Speckled Bird Cooperative, the Atlanta Cooperative News Project, or whatever it's called, and so that marked, we eventually started putting out women's issues, and so on and so forth. But the Atlanta Women's, we launched the Atlanta Women's Liberation Movement, an entity, and raised the money and rented a house as a safe place for women that needed protection from a violent partner, and also where we met and cooked up the next thing we were going to do. So that was very much a theme of my work in the Bird, and a huge internal discussion that would produce or not produce what was going to be in the pages of the paper. And when I look back at the roles that I played, I was an active opinion setter and participant in the internal debates that went on what we're going to do, where we're going to go, how we're going to do this, and the debates that could become quite toxic, or quite debilitating about how we're going to work together as fellow human beings in this construct to get the job done that we all want to do. So whether I was working outside the bird, some daytime hours, or being there full time, I think it was the time that I was there full time was not. Most of my time was volunteer time there, because I was really earning the household budget at certain periods in there, because I had a job that paid a standard for the time wage, and none of us were. Money was simply not important to us. I mean, that's not who we were. We were idealists. We were not materialists. And you had enough money for your daily needs, but people living together in groups to make a budget work. People, the constant struggle to around finances for the bird was huge, and more and more people came on the scene as we built and grew. It very rapidly exploded up from those 6 people, and there are others that were playing seminal roles. Very, very soon after that, it didn't stay at by any means a 6-person operation. And Anne did not really come over to the bird and work there. She was doing the much more cultural work, the Southern Folk Culture Festival project, et cetera, et cetera. She was much more. That's where her energies were in the main. All the rest of us were involved in core ways and operations. Stephanie Coffin certainly emerged as a major force in her sensibilities around graphics and design, and her work ethic, and really, you look back and in terms of layout and look, Stephanie had a central role. But she can speak about that. She lived it. She walked in those shoes. But there was, I cannot stress enough how much internal debate and thrashing out views and personalities, and trying to operate in new age ways of more consensus, and figuring out how to function despite our differences in outlook. And you have manipulative personalities. Anytime you get human beings together, you have the alphas, you have the extroverts, you have all those dynamics that you have in any situation. And so we were young and learning as we went, and figuring out how to sell ads. We had people who played primary roles. Marjorie Jordan, I guess, has been interviewed by now, but
not yet.
No.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
On the list, though.
Yep.
Can you say some more about the internal dynamics and what you called debilitating debates? What was at the center of them specifically, like particularly in this issue of women's roles and sort of an equal footing?
Well,
was it as simplistic as some of the guys on the paper just blatantly saying, like, no, women don't do that, or like?
Well, there was resistance of men to acknowledge that there were any distinctions being made. There was that, and roles and titles and who was really doing the work and who was getting the credit, and the dynamics of how we related to each other, whose opinions were respected, whose were disregarded. Nothing real surprising, but pretty typical. It's that, I mean, in that setting, the women did not meekly sit by. The women were actively raising issues and challenging the status quo, and calling out sexism, wherever it happened. And that's not a languid, calming, business as usual, no ruffled feathers, no waves, rocking the boat. That's not what that is. It's the opposite of that. It was boat rocking, and it was ruffling feathers, and it was. It would ultimately take. It's coming to the point of saying that there's going to be a women's issue, and so did you have people? Did you have you had resistance, and you'll always find people who, quite confident in their own sense of where things should be going, and get out of the way and let me do this. I know where we're going. We're doing this. Get out of the way. We're not. I don't want to talk about this anymore. We've wasted too much time talking about this. We're not going to build a consensus. We need to get busy and go do this. There's that attitude of that was certainly expressed by some of the guys. So there was an impatience with the process of let's get to consensus. Let's hash something out. Jean Guerrero said in the aftermath of our divorce that the women's liberation movement, killed his marriage. Well, but because we were rocking and rolling. The women we had our own meetings. Now I will tell you, in my memory, and this is not unimportant, and I'm not confident in my memory, but I'm just thinking back, how much time and energy did we put into matters of race? We were significantly, overwhelmingly white, and we covered struggles in the black community, but we were not of the black community, and we were, as I believe is a typical situation when an institution is started by whites, the work and the consciousness to have that institution fully integrated and equally owned by people of color is enormously challenging. And it started overwhelmingly as a white institution, and it remained overwhelmingly white in its first iteration. An African American man led a resurgence, if you will, or a later version of the bird. I wasn't involved in that, but I'm simply saying, when I look at the battles and the clashes and the energy around women's equality, it was great and large and huge. It was a big dynamic. And it's going to be interesting, in these interviews with all of these folks, to hear their perspective on that. Whether it was an annoyance, whether it was oh, those women never could get along. It'll be interesting to hear, because for myself, and I think others that I know, that those struggles were seminal and were important, and we were finding our voices and raising our own consciousness. We had, as was common in the day, it was a feature of the women's movement, women's consciousness raising groups, where you supported each other, and had continuity, and was very much an admixture of the personal and the political, that the personal was political. And it introduced a dynamic that I think is always around, but a forceful and fairly public manifestation of a dynamic of women talking to each other about their dissatisfactions in their relationships with men. All right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that can be threatening. I mean, that can be, as Gene once put it, the women's liberation movement killed my marriage, you know. Totally, really hilarious to me when I heard that he had said that. That one of his Gabby friends told on him. So it'll be interesting to see whether that was, those who viewed that as a distraction, as a hindrance, as something that took up way too much time and didn't mean anything or get anywhere, and those for whom that as women they feel that they blossomed in that setting, supported by other women, and in consciousness raising groups and working in the Women's Caucus and so on and so forth. Another emerging issue at the time was the LGBT battle, which during that period, and there's some great historical work that's been done on this. That was a period in the very early 70s, possibly. I don't think it was in the 60s, but there was the first Gay Pride open march in Atlanta, and the Bird had coverage of that issue. Now, I don't recall that there was any big internal schism, upheaval, etc. Within the Bird over. I mean, I just literally don't have a memory of it. But at this age, you get used to the fact that, you know what, I really hadn't thought about that in decades, and I'm not quite sure. I do not have a recollection of a significant upheaval around that issue within the Bird, like there was around the women's equality. And as I said, there was not any kind of great amount of challenging our whiteness. I mean, we worked to cover struggles in the black community, issues that were going on in the black community, but as far as kind of internally in the Bird circle, looking around at each other and dealing with racism within our ranks. Again, it doesn't leap out at me. Somebody could come with a very vibrant perspective on it, and pointing out things that I have forgotten. And I was active in the first iteration of the Bird. You know, by 71. I mean, in 1970, I went to Cuba, and. Returned probably spring of 1970, and then much more at some point, you know, a lot of us were studying theory of change and how revolutions are made and what other countries' histories are and what do we think about where we're going in this country. There was a lot of, and in that period, SOC was attacked by SDS and taken down. Southern Student Organizing Committee had kind of been the version of, the Southern version, the grits and collard greens version of SDS. SOC was on Southern campuses in the main, not SDS. SDS was on Florida campuses. There was an SDS chapter at a point at UVA at some point going forward, but the SDS fever and fervor and organizing and mobilizing was on the northern campuses overwhelmingly. But there came a time as the movement split out and splintered and embraced different strands of ideological thought and staked out their turf, and big political wars inside national political organizations on the left. The attention was turned to SOC and to an emerging, a thread in SOC of embracing Southernism to the point of instead of a black-white handshake, having a black-white handshake over the Confederate flag, maybe, but the dicey use of the Confederate flag, where fair-minded people could agree or disagree on it. My point is that was a phenomenon that was happening around 1970. But by the end of 1970, I was really moving systematic. I was really putting space between myself and the bird work. I was not in there on a daily or weekly basis anymore by the end of that year. I think that the demarcation was going to Cuba for that 6-week period, and then by 71 I had decided to work in a plant and strengthen my organizing skills. There were outbreaks of wildcat strikes around racial issues in several at Rich's, at Coke, I think, at Mead Packaging, at Nabisco, an array of those, and Jose Williams was a leader in those, and it was in that period that I was leaving the bird and going into a factory to organize, and to oppose the racism in the unions and help rebuild a union that was going to really reflect the voices of all the workers. So that was the demarcation for me was 67 to late 70, and Gene and I divorced at the very end of that year as well, and he worked for the bird and then moved over at some point to the running the ACLU chapter for Atlanta, for Georgia, and so that's the slice of the bird. That's when I was, involved in the heat of the bird work.
Following up on a couple points there. Particularly in reference again to women and women pushing the bird to be fairer, like at these collective meetings or the editorial meetings where a lot of this is being hashed out, these issues are being hashed out, what percentage would you say were women in attendance any given week?
Oh, that's a good question. I hadn't really thought about the ratio. It's interesting. We were not in a great minority, or a tiny minority. We were not 50% or more. There was not a radical imbalance in numbers, as I recall. But it's a great question. I mean, that's interesting. I'd hesitate to quantify it. It was less than half, but we weren't minuscule at all. We were a healthy size, healthy number of women in there, but not 50%. And we experienced, and the bird was growing and building as the national and international, the regional, national, and international phenomena were occurring, like the end of the Vietnam War, the Kent State, going into Cambodia, Jackson State. That was 19 70. I'm almost exact, but really both of those occurred in 1970. So it was it was an incredibly volatile time on the political scene, and towards the end of my direct involvement in the Bird, there was a schism. There was a schism of ideological. There were those who pushed against the Bird becoming too much under the influence of ideological outlooks, and this is happening with SDS is splintering, Weatherman forming, and violence versus nonviolence. You had the earlier emergence of the Black Panthers. You had the point at which SNCC kind of busted apart on the rocks of which direction should we go in, and a whole slice of SNCC leadership started going to Africa. White SNCC organizers were told, you don't have a role here. You need to be working in the white community. There were schisms all over, and the exposure of informants of the FBI in left movements, and looking around and sorting out who that might be in our ranks. So and interestingly, I haven't said anything about this, but the reality is in America that these underground newspapers had sprung up spontaneously all across the country as a real measure of how much opposition there was to the old ways of thinking and of framing the political debate. The fact that there was a phenomenon that this left movement all across the country, both culturally and politically, felt the need to be able to speak with an independent voice. And it was very fitting that when we had our 40th anniversary, we brought Ellen Goodman as our main speaker, whose work with independent journalism today, has huge significance. And they figured out how to be on radio and on the internet and on television.
Oh, Amy Goodman.
Amy Goodman. I said Ellen Goodman. I said Ellen Goodman, the more mainstream columnist. No, Amy Goodman was our keynote speaker at that gathering. And so we were part of a much larger sweep of history than I think we consciously thought of as we were living over there in the shadow of the neon Krispy Kreme billboards on Ponce de Leon and cooking this up and launching it and starting it. And is that this was happening all around the country. And I don't know the dates of when the Berkeley Barb or the different ones emerged. It's a knowable fact. I just don't have it at my fingertips, right. and where we fit into that. But my second husband was part of building Alice up at Virginia Tech as an alternative press. So it was happening on, ultimately on campuses and just all over the country. We were one of the longer survivors, and we were in the hinterlands of the American left. We were down here in the Bible Belt, old slave Confederacy states, where the most reactionary opinions flourished and were viewed as mainstream. But that whole sweep of figuring out a way to put your voice and your views out there, contrary to the mainstream, a long and proud history, freedom of the press, and the Bird very much is part of that, and capturing the phenomenon of the Bird and the other underground, the whole underground press movement. Well, we had the Liberation News Service, which was our own AP that got mailed to us. It didn't get sent on a wire, but there was a huge, and when you talk to young people in later years about that, I mean, it's challenging to describe the enormous ferment and tumult and change that the 60s represented. We were one iteration of it right here in Atlanta, but all the Dylan songs you can think of about that period. Senators and congressmen, please heed the call. Mm-hmm. Don't stand in the doorways. Don't block up the hall. I mean, there was a mighty push for fundamental change in this country that ultimately got pretty tamped down and stamped out, and it's we're seeing another resurgence now. The Black Lives Matter movement, I think, is massively significant. It's a new generation of protest and social change, and it's much more diverse. The new generations of all colors are much more embracing diversity and change, and the it's interesting, and I don't know the answer. I don't know, but my impression is that today's protest is much more diverse, and there are many more white allies of the struggles in the communities of color, and that is a good thing. But they're powerful forces at work to tamp down, to stomp out those who push for change. And I remember when Fred Hampton was shot in his bed in Chicago, Black Panthers, and by law enforcement, and I told my mother that, and she just scoffed. That couldn't be true. And I'm just paranoid, and what'll I come up with next? Where do you get all these crazy ideas that people would be shot in their beds just for, being in an organization that was protesting government policy? And when Watergate broke loose, which was another one of the huge developments of that time, when Watergate was unmasked and the hearing started, my mother called me and said, "You were right. I didn't believe you, but they are capable of shooting people in their beds." So, I say that to say the level of vicious retaliation against the left. Never, don't hold any false idealistic notions that there won't be efforts to crush any protest that's challenging the status quo and the those who hold power. I mean, interestingly enough, the lovely couple in the White House that are winding up their last days of their 8-year stay, President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama, on just one thing, they sought to make waves and to turn things in a different direction, and that's on big food at the organic garden in on the White House grounds. And the big food industry, and it is documented, came down hard on them. They didn't even like them calling that garden organic, because a whole mega industry of how food is produced in this country and what it's turned into and the profits that are made off of it and the bad health outcomes. I mean, this is not imperialist war. This is a massive industry that's far too unchecked in what it's been shoveling out on the American plate, right? And there's the compelling New York Times Magazine article about how that was shut down. That was scooted over here into a much safer, smaller space of not challenging what big food is putting on our plates. And that's just one recent example that comes to mind, but it's well documented in this New York Times Magazine issue just in recent weeks. You're up against mighty and powerful forces, and we're seeing it in this presidential race. Yeah. So, but that's no reason to faint and grow weary and pull back from the struggle.
You mentioned these couple conversations with your mom of what you were perceiving or witnessing going on, a reality that she couldn't see that eventually she did. Leading up to that point and beyond it, how did your family respond to your emerging activism, beginning with, I remember in previous interviews you talked about secretly going to the March on Washington.
Right.
But by the time that you were in college and being involved with SNCC and then anti-war and the Bird and going to Cuba and labor and working in the factories later on, we could list a whole lot of things, but how did your family respond to the sort of public role and just your political outlook?
Well, my family were not natural reactionaries. They were, and I'm speaking of my mother and father, and my grandmother and my aunt, who were too close, the relatives in the broader family that were close to us on my mother's side. They were not knee-jerk reactionaries by any means. They were not knee-jerk racists. I credit my mother's. She had a lot of positive influence from the Methodist Church, the denomination that they raised us in. My dad, I think, had been in a Baptist denomination in South Georgia, but the Methodist Church as an institution, took progressive stands on race and on women, and she had that as a reinforcing influence. But they did not have immoderate views. Now, my father voted for Goldwater. Was the first Republican he ever voted for. Yes, he did. See, he was in that Chamber of Commerce, and there was that influence there, that world view that gets promoted in those circles. And he was an executive director of the Chamber for a vast part of his working life, leaving behind the U.S. Forestry Service. And there was never any, some people absolutely, the FBI went around in the South for people that went to Cuba. They went around and knocked on doors, talking to family members about, do you know that your child is involved in all this dangerous thinking and thought, and being appearing at the door in a menacing way, but do you know how much trouble your child could get into, et cetera, et cetera. They never went to my parents, but I can list you names of people that were in more rural, small town, southern situations, like Joe Bogle, for example, who I think did go to Cuba and who was involved in social change work and worked in a factory and et cetera, et cetera. But my family never withdrew from me or shunned me. They had some harsh criticisms when I came back from SNCC, you know. And my mother, I told you this, I think, but when I was in Cuba, my mother said to my sister-in-law, and she and my brother had moved down to Atlanta and their first child born was called a bird baby. They were around the bird. My brother was at UVA in the Students for Social Action that Howard Romaine headed.
Oh, okay. I wasn't aware.
Jody Grogan and Linda Grogan. And when they moved down and we shared a duplex, and they their child, the birth of their first child was an announcement in the Bird as a bird baby. We had a whole slew of births that occurred to people that were in the Bird and around the Bird. And my mother said to my sister-in-law, again we were sharing a duplex, so when Nan gets back from Cuba, can you get her doing just trying to get her doing some normal things, like teaching her some more sewing and all that handwork that you do. Can we just get her doing something normal? But all four of the five siblings, four of us are all Democrats, and none of us were reactionary. And there's one brother that votes Republican off and on and voted for Perot and is much more conservative and much more acquisitional. He's the only person that's had any financial success out of those five kids to speak of. I mean, meaning very, 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 very comfortable, plenty of margin, right? The rest of us just get along. But and then you look at the sweep of things over time. I mean, here I am now, a state senator in the land of my father's birth, right? And his father was a sharecropper, and ultimately, I mean, came down to that, in his last days. And so there is this other twist that she wound up doing something more mainstream, but I don't look back, and I'll tell you this, and I probably said it already in one of these interviews, but my mother wrote me years later and said, "I'm so proud of you. You understood that Dr. King was right, and you saw it so much earlier, and you acted on it, and I'm proud of the fact that you did that," which is that's a letter from a mother that a daughter would always hope to have. So there was never permanent schism, and those tensions seem so long ago and far away now. Now I do thank my mother for being a bulldog about making me go back to my senior year in college. I might never have had the degree, because life goes on. We all know that, and see it all around us. But she literally sent down some relatives to fetch me up when I said I wasn't going to come back and get back in school my senior year. When Jim Foreman at SNCC said, "No, stay down here," said, "Stay, and we'll pay your tuition later when you got to go back and finish up that year." And wonderfully, we went home to Virginia and started organizing on the campus and worked right there. And I very meaningfully 50-year reunion of our there was a march that commemorated a march that we did 50 years ago this past summer in August of 65, a voting rights march in the county where I worked, in Lunenburg County, Virginia. And when we had a reunion of VSCRC, went back in the area a couple of years ago, local people came and were all involved with us and reconnected with us at that reunion in Blackstone, Virginia. And they decided, a couple of real movers and shakers, to do the NAACP led and other people too, led a reenactment, built a reenactment of the march that we did for voter rights 50 years ago, and scheduled it on the same week or day that we did it 50 years ago, and something like 300 people marched then, and this time I think 400 people RSVP'd online to march, and it was a 96-degree day, and close to 300 showed up and marched this long march, but I don't know, 3 mile or something march in 96-degree weather out to the courthouse, and reenacted the march for voting rights, and which is certainly salient today. My God, the battle that we've got to expand voting rights. I mean, the barriers are incredible, and they're very baked in all the way down to how you get a ballot, how the online access is fraught with pitfalls. Just last night at the office of the nonprofit where I work, Women's Action for New Directions, we were doing, the local chapter was doing GOTV work and phoning people, and the security guard in the building had moved up here from Florida and had not moved her registration up here, and she didn't know she could do anything about it. And one of our gurus got on the computer and got her absentee ballot ordered from Florida to be mailed up here, and it was 24 hours before the deadline. So she's going to be able to turn that around and vote. But if she hadn't had a guru, a Hampshire College graduate who does this work full-time of working in voting rights and online stuff, if she hadn't had him, she could have never crossed all those hurdles that are baked in to the Florida online application for an absentee ballot. You have to go back 18 pages to get the address of where to and she had to write out her signature and scan it and have it sent to them for them to okay that she's the son, and she could have never passed all those hurdles. Mm-hmm. And it's just, and Florida, is a chronic abuser on blocking people from the ballot. But there we were at a 50-year anniversary on voting rights. And back then, they wouldn't, the way they stopped it in Virginia, it's not the same way in Mississippi. They'd club you down and throw you in the jailhouse and kick you off the plantation and so on and so forth in the 60s if you tried to vote. In Virginia, they'd just close the damn office and never be available and have this tiny little window where you could go register. Tiny little window. So that's what we were marching about, is the access to the ballot being blocked. And I looked out, and I was a speaker at that event just a few months back this summer. August of 2016. And you looked out, and there were all these people of that generation that we were working with and organizing. And there was all this staunchness and all of these, women my age out there marching in this 96-degree heat, and people in wheelchairs, and people, whole churches bringing their church bus full of people. And there was this fierce intentionality. And this is not a county where the other day they did A, B, C, or D. This is, what was being tapped into was that reservoir of history in those counties. We get out and fight, we get out and march, we get out and speak our piece, we stand up to power, and people knew what they were doing there. And it was a great day because it was a reflection that when investing all that work and organizing in those counties shifted people's consciousness and awareness. And when they were called on 50 years later to come forward, those who had been teenagers and young adults came forward 50 years later, and along with all layers of newer, younger people, and the damn issue is still the same. access to the ballot. And so there's, just be not confused. The battle continues, as they say in Spanish, la lucha continua. And next week is election day. On my birthday, I might get a big present.
I pray.
Of electing our first female to occupy the White House as the president. So, and then the battles will continue, because it will be to push her to do the right thing and not cave to the whomever is pulling the strings, to the big money that pulls the strings.
The struggle never ends.
No, it does not. It's a river. It's a river. The struggle, I see it as a river of justice flowing through history. The stream that runs through history is a battle for justice, battle for fuller rights, equality, and justice. And quiet as it's kept, or as little as the American people, as much luxury as the American people have to be blind to it, the struggles that are going on around the global struggles are phenomenal. The battles that people are up against for survival, to survive and thrive. It just stunning, the inequality in the world, and the lack of access, and the what's going on here with 1%, 3%, having the vast slice of the wealth, while other people. I was just looking the other day. The Fight for 15 movement is another, is emblematic of this upsurge, saying, "Hell no, we're not going to take it anymore." And here's a guy at I don't want to call. I mean, it's one of the big names. I believe it's McDonald's, but I could be wrong. 32 years he has worked at that fast food restaurant, and he's earning $10 and change an hour. And he said I'm stepping up, I'm speaking out. And so praise be to the SEIU that decided to go fund that, of people that will likely never be able to pay a union dues. It's not about paying a union dues. It's about fighting for justice. That's why the labor unions were stomped. They tried to stomp them out of existence. So yes, the struggle continues.
So on back to that point of your family's reaction, you said there was no permanent schism.
Well, no, I mean we had big fusses, and it's so long ago. I mean, my Lord, what happened in 1960? Because there was nothing that permanently marked it. I showed up at my brother's wedding in a Nelson Mandela shirt, but that was an accident. My luggage got lost between Atlanta and D.C., and the bag didn't arrive, and I had to show up at the wedding in what I had on. So, and so there are family jokes like that. Did you plan that? You really planned to wear that Nelson Mandela T-shirt, didn't you? But we have and 4 of my 5 siblings agree with me massively on what I do and say and think, and they are active and participatory in their own way in their own lives. So I have warm family ties.
Yeah, I'm not trying to belabor the point, but also don't want to gloss over that.
Oh, sure. Well, let's be clear. I mean, Ann Braden writes about it. She was from rural Alabama, small town Alabama, and when she became a kind of a rogue journalist, when she started speaking truth to power in her role as a journalist, and married Carl Braden, who was much more to the left than she was, at the time. But she was treated by her family, and she points this out in her book, that in the South it would be typical if you crossed that line and didn't go with the status quo, you were treated as that you were dead, and the community was sympathetic to the family who'd lost a child, and that's the way that was the treatment that she received. You're dead to me, and you hear that to this day of people who step out. Now, it's interesting. Some of my old friends in civil rights, and I didn't realize it at the time, in more than one example, like that they couldn't go to Mississippi because their mother said, "I'll throw myself out the window. You will kill me. I will have a heart attack and die if you go to Mississippi. I will be so fearful of what's going to happen to you. You're killing me. You can't do this to your mother." And so they came to Atlanta to work in the SNCC office in Atlanta instead of Mississippi, where the Klan's on every street corner. So, yeah, there are real horrifying stories of people that were. Well, look at what happens to gay kids. That's not the past. That's the present. Mm-hmm. All of the incredible statistics around suicide and drug dependence. All of those battles that a child or an adult coming out has to, in so many cases, go through. And then you're so proud when you hear those beautiful stories of parents that grew and opened their hearts and joined PFLAG and have a whole new understanding of the world. And that's growing. But change doesn't happen overnight. Cultural shift doesn't happen overnight. And that the LGBT movement is really, it's a fascinating, from a scholar's point of view, to look at cultural shift and social change and engagement, and see where we are today, for goodness sake, where the battles that have been fought and won, to the horrendous things that happen in the worst Matthew Shepard cases, but commonplace. A young man that I was at the Democratic Convention with, from Albany, Georgia, and has family members that have he doesn't exist to them, mm-hmm. because he came out. And that's shocking to say, commonplace. So when I look at my sweet little family, we had our bumps in the road, but they came out overall, really being proud of me. And that's so often not the case. And my mother wrote a letter one time, "What on earth did I do that 3 of my 5 children are Unitarians and don't even believe in Jesus Christ? How did this happen to me?" And I wrote her back. This was in the days where you wrote letters. Mm-hmm. I wrote her back and said, "Mom, it's a testament to your open-mindedness. You should be proud of the fact that you raise children who think for themselves and have the wherewithal to make choices based on weighing things and deciding what's right for them, and not just going along because they're supposed to do it." I said, "It's a testament to your open-mindedness. It's a wonderful, wonderful gift that you gave us." And on that cheery note, I think I've got to go.
Okay.
It's noon.
I know that you, and I understand that, but before the interview started, you mentioned that you were hoping to wrap this up.
Uh-huh.
If I could convince you to give 10 more minutes to follow up on just a couple questions.
I'll talk short. What are they?
Okay. One of the follow-ups was, in talking about sort of the percentage of women in the
Bird,
the Bird collective
uh-huh.
meetings and editorial meetings. To what extent was there agreement among the women themselves when you would be having these conversations?
Well, there was significant agreement. I mean, I can think of tensions between individual women that were in the collective. Like if somebody slept with somebody's husband, well, hello there. Not quite the feminist we thought you were, are you?
So that happened.
Yeah. But no, the culture among the women was to support each other. I mean, there was a notable exception or two, but to support each other and support the push for women's equality in the collective. Yeah.
So do I understand correctly that women were also organized amongst themselves, like when you guys would have consciousness raising, or women would attend consciousness raising meetings together, that there was talk outside of the meetings among the women, sort of on the direction?
Well, yeah, we had a women's caucus in the Bird.
Okay.
So we would have meetings of women that were focused on pushing forward our standing and our equality in the Bird Collective. And there was a women's movement that we participated in and helped build that had more women in it than just the people that were at the Bird. And we're doing things, and we're in consciousness raising groups and supporting that house, supporting the Atlanta Women's Movement, the Atlanta Women's Liberation Movement, which is poorly documented, but because it was so early and so nascent, it was an early emerger, and more stuff took wings, shortly thereafter. But yes, the women were a force inside the Bird, and we met among ourselves, and there are things like jealousies or little power struggles or people that are oppositional by nature and never going to go along with anything. Those phenomena occurred among the women, but it wasn't the main aspect at all.
How long? What years would you say Atlanta's women's liberation movement endured?
Oh my God, I would started in the 60s, and there was the Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance, Alpha, that went on for...
That started in like 73 and went well into the 90s.
And you've got documentation on that thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah. So... And in the early 80s, the struggle for equal Rights Amendment, ERA. There was a full-throated struggle here at the legislature trying to get that ratified. So there have been in different formations and different iterations, there's been work done on women's equality ever since then, that I'm aware of. The Black Women's Wellness Project, a notable example that still exists today in terms of delivering services to low-income Black women. But there's iteration after iteration. The NOW chapters have come and gone. I think there's one newly formed now, and there's the Georgia Win List, which is to get pro-choice Democratic women elected, and actually the annals at Georgia State are full of the stories of these women that and the building of the Atlanta Women's Foundation to fund women's work. the iterations are just endless now.
So there were
Many strains and threads. Yeah. Oh,
iterations.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But the actual group that you were participating
Oh,
in.
that what, Atlanta Women's Liberation
Yeah.
movement? I don't think there was anybody operating under that banner by the early 70s. And because people that were seminal to it just, went off in different directions. But the Women in Numbers, Georgia Win List, we launched a pro-choice kind of PAC that raised $80,000 at its first meeting. And I was already elected to office, so it was in the probably early 90s. I mean, when I got in the legislature, within a matter of 3 years or so, we built a women's caucus, which exists to this day. Meets every week during the session. Has to fight the slings and arrows of the outrageous GOP, who, since they're controlling things, they want to shut it down or not take policy stands and so on and so forth. But the outgrowths of the modern women's movement of the 60s are alive and well today. And actually, Gloria Steinem said this, that the women's book group phenomenon, which is mushroomed all over this country. I mean, massive. Is today's iteration of the consciousness raising group. It's women consciously getting together and building ties and being supportive of each other and discussing ideas and staying up with each other's lives and being a mainstay in the lives of individual women, and it's a national phenomenon. In fact, I'm going to my women's book group tonight.
Very good.
Last month we've been together for 30. That group has probably been together now close to 40 years. I've been in it for 30 years.
Wow.
Okay, and we read John Lewis's March last month, and tonight we're reading the first of the trilogy of the Neapolitan novels written by this Italian woman. So at any rate, to this day, the women's movement and the whole battle now for women's economic issues. I mean, things have soared since the 60s in terms of the understanding international development, that if you fund women with micro enterprise loans, they have a 99% success rate compared to the guys, because they're not spending the money on gambling and women and boozing and drugging. They're investing in their children, investing in family security. That women at the tables of peace, the peace that's negotiated when women are fully represented at a peace table, is much more sustainable because it's rooted in the woman's connectivity to the community and to the family, and not about turf and power struggles, and which guy's going to get how big a cut of the gold, so it's internationally acknowledged now. If you educate the women and girls in a country, you're on your path to national stability. If you fail to do that, you're working with one hand tied behind your back. So there's been a whole sea change, and this finally the U.S. getting into posture after she's taken incredible slings and arrows that are very much gender-based, a different standard applied to Hillary Clinton than to a male candidate, that we're going to have a woman in the White House, it seems. So, as the old Joe Hill song said, it never died. No, he said, I never died. Yeah, I never died, said he. You were shot and killed by the bosses. No, I never died. And the women's movement has continued to emerge and flower and take new formations, and I've been privileged to work in a women's organization that's committed to stop war and nuclear holocaust, and I've done that. I've been involved in that since the early '90s, Women's Action for New Directions, and headed up the women legislator lobby group of that. That's a network of progressive women legislators around the country, and so there's the thread between what I was doing when we started the Great Speckled Bird, of speaking out against war, and here's our little pin that shows global military spending. And guess who's got the long, tall blue? Guess who's the next 6 nations combined? I think Russia, China, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of them combined don't begin to match what we're spending. Yeah, and so there's a thread all the way through my adult life that the bird was certainly a big part of, and that was launched in opposition to war making. And here we are, yet and still today, looking at what would Trump's hand on the nuclear buttons look like. So these threads of social change and striving for a better world, as we've said, have a constant stream, and they ebb and flow, but throughout the history of humankind, those are the same struggles. Moving forward, what are we going to do? What is humanity going to do with its game? Moving towards equality and everybody having a shot, and having government that's strong enough to tamp down the takers. To protect people from oppression. At any rate, on that cheery note.
Yes. One very, very quick last question. Have you maintained relationships with any of the folks from the Bird over the years?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I'm still connected to the Coffins. Sue Thrasher was around. My first husband, Gene Guerrero. My very own brother, Howard Romaine, and I communicate regularly, as well as with his sister and his daughter. And Dorothy Prasad. I don't know if she's on your list to interview, but it was Dorothy Bueno, Bouno. And she just lives down the street from me. So we see each other, many times a week. And she's in that. And then there are people that are in town that I see very infrequently, But since we did the 40th reunion, then having people come back every year for a potluck. I was on business travel, so I missed the one this year. But that's a way of staying in touch. And Krista Brewer, who was pivotal in the later iteration of the Bird, and I are closest friends. So there are, and Marjorie Jordan and I socialize, and Susan Goodman. Did you ever interview her?
Not yet.
She left town. She's moved to Washington. Bob Goodman, we get together and play Scrabble and sing, and are on the same listservs. Yeah, we get mutually mobilized. Ted Brodak. There's a whole community of people here. David Nolan, because he was in the VSCRC stuff. Becky Hamilton, and it's made it easier somewhat because we're having these gatherings that people do come in from other places. But there's a significant slice of people that never left Atlanta. Yeah, so we're in touch, and we're glad that Georgia State has played such a incredible role in capturing, digitizing. In fact, just last week I was at the chiropractor, and the woman who's Iranian the wife of the chiropractor who works in the office, said, "Oh, I know you. Weren't you involved with the great speckled bird?" I said, "How on earth, Iranian woman, do you know this?" And she said, I just follow things, and I was following thread, and she was thrilled to know. I mean, she's a highly intelligent, curious, bright professor who's kind of scaling down from that. Has more time, and somehow she came across the great speckled bird reference somewhere, and she was thrilled to know that it's digitized here at Georgia State. She couldn't believe it. And that's something that was a week ago.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm glad the word is out.
That's right. That's right.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time and coming repeatedly
Well,
to
because
talk
I talk
with
so
me.
long. Because I talk so long. So
And
I'm
I
saying
love it.
goodbye.
Thank you.